the discovery that horrified Cleveland. On a September afternoon in 1935, two boys chasing a rolling ball down a weed-choked slope in a Cleveland ravine known as Kingsbury Run stumbled onto something that would haunt the city for the rest of the decade. Half buried in the brush lay the body of a man, stripped naked, his skin stained a strange leathery tan as though it had been treated with some chemical. His head was gone. Nearby, a second body lay in similar condition, also headless, also missing evidence of who he had once been. The police who arrived that day had seen violence before. Cleveland in the 1930s was no stranger to gang killings, bootlegger shootouts, and the occasional domestic tragedy. But this was different. The precision of the cuts, the almost surgical separation of the head from the neck, and the deliberate placement of the bodies suggested something investigators had never encountered in the city's history. A killer who took his time, who possessed some degree of anatomical knowledge, and who seemed to want his work to be found. As detectives combed the ravine, they quickly realized that this was not a single, isolated crime. Kingsbury Run, a natural gully cutting through the city's industrial flats, had long served as a shelter for homeless drifters riding the rails in search of work. It was a place the city preferred not to look at too closely, and that investigators would come to understand was exactly what had made it so useful to a killer. Word spread through the newspapers within hours. A double murder, both victims decapitated, both left in a public ravine within the city limits. Reporters converged on the scene. Editors sensed a story that would sell papers for years, and the public began to ask the question that would define the remainder of the decade. Who was doing this, and why could nobody stop him? Detectives assigned to the case were experienced men, but nothing in their training had prepared them for a killer who dismembered his victims with what appeared to be genuine surgical skill, drained their bodies of blood before disposal, and left almost no physical evidence behind. It would take weeks before investigators pieced together an unsettling fact. This discovery in Kingsbury Run was not the beginning of the killings. Evidence would later suggest that the killer had already claimed at least one, and possibly more, victims. Before that September day, bodies that had gone unnoticed or misclassified in a city already accustomed to the deaths of anonymous drifters. As the two ravine victims were transported to the morgue, Cleveland's homicide detectives began an investigation that would eventually draw in the city's most famous lawmen, consume enormous public resources, and ultimately end in failure. The killer who would come to be known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, or sometimes the Cleveland Torso Murderer, had announced himself to the city, and he was only getting started. In the days that followed, the coroner's office worked to determine as much as possible from the two bodies, but the absence of heads made even basic identification a formidable challenge. Detectives circulated what few details they had, approximate age, build, any distinguishing marks found on the remaining flesh, and waited for someone, anyone, to come forward with a name. Few did. The silence that answered their inquiries was itself telling, a signal of just how disconnected the victims had been from the ordinary networks of family, employer, and neighbor that might otherwise have raised an alarm. Newspaper photographers were kept at a distance from the ravine itself, but that did little to slow the spread of lurid speculation once word of a headless body reached the city desks. Editors recognized instantly that this was a story with staying power, and within a week the phrase Kingsbury Run murders had become a fixture of the local press, a phrase that would recur with growing dread for years to come. Part 2. Cleveland. During the Great Depression. To understand why the torso murders were possible and why they went unsolved, it is necessary to understand the Cleveland of the 1930s, a city buckling under the weight of the Great Depression. Once one of America's great industrial powerhouses, Cleveland had been devastated by the economic collapse. Steel mills that had employed tens of thousands sat partially idle. Unemployment soared. Families lost homes, and entire encampments of displaced workers, known as Hoovervilles, after the president many blamed for the crisis, sprang up along riverbanks and rail yards across the city. Kingsbury Run itself, with its maze of railroad tracks feeding into the flats, became one such gathering point. Transients, many of them riding freight trains from city to city in search of any available labor, set up makeshift camps in the ravine, sleeping in it, shacks built from scrap wood and cardboard, cooking over open fires, and moving on when the trains called them elsewhere. This population was, by its very nature, invisible to the systems that might otherwise have tracked its members. Many had no fixed address, no steady employer, no family nearby to report them missing. Some had abandoned their birth names entirely, adopting nicknames or aliases as they drifted from town to town. Cleveland's police force, like most departments of the era, had limited resources for tracking a population that was constantly in motion. There was no national missing persons database, no computerized fingerprint system, no DNA analysis. A man could vanish from a hobo camp in Kingsbury Run, and nobody outside that camp would ever know to ask what happened to him. It was, in effect, a perfect hunting ground. A killer targeting these transient men and women, many struggling with poverty, alcoholism, or displacement, could operate with a degree of impunity that would have been impossible against victims embedded in stable communities. Organized crime, too, cast a long shadow over the city, and detectives were already stretched thin. Fighting bootlegging operations, gambling rings, and the occasional gangland murder. The torso killings, disturbing as they were, competed with a broader landscape of urban crime for police attention and resources. This is not to say the deaths went uninvestigated. Quite the opposite. The case would eventually become one of the most extensively resourced investigations in the city's history. But the fundamental problem, that many victims could not be identified and few people even knew to report them missing, meant that the killer held an enormous advantage from the very beginning. He was, in effect, preying on people the system had already rendered nearly invisible. The irony was not lost on later historians that a city home to some of the era's most celebrated civic institutions, hospitals, universities, and museums, harbored within its industrial flats a population so thoroughly overlooked that a killer could operate among them for years without detection. Charitable missions and relief agencies did what they could to feed and shelter the displaced, but their resources were stretched thin across an entire region reeling from economic collapse. And the sheer scale of need meant that any single individual's disappearance was easily lost amid the broader tide of suffering. Local officials, for their part, tended to view the Kingsbury Run encampments as a nuisance to be managed rather than a community deserving of the same protective attention given to residential neighborhoods, a mindset that, in retrospect, only made the ravine a more attractive hunting ground for a predator who understood exactly how little scrutiny his victims would receive. Part 3. The first victims. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they determined that the two bodies found in September 1935 were likely not the killer's first. An earlier victim, a young woman whose remains had been found the previous year along the shore of Lake Erie, was later reconsidered as a possible early casualty of the same killer, though this connection was never conclusively proven. What was clear was that the September discovery marked the idea Sato. Home at Cleveland, authorities recognized a pattern. One of the two men found in the ravine was eventually identified through fingerprint records as Edward Andruschi, a local man with a minor criminal history who was known to frequent bars and rougher corners of the city. The second victim, and remains unnamed to this day, known only by an evidence tag. This pattern, one identifiable victim and one who would forever remain a mystery, would repeat itself throughout the case. Forensic science in the mid-1930s was rudimentary by modern standards. Fingerprint identification existed, but depended entirely on the victim already having a record on file. There was no method for extracting genetic material from a body, no way to compare unidentified remains against a national database, because no such database existed. Coroners could estimate a victim's age, approximate height, and sometimes occupation based on calluses or old injuries, but these clues rarely led to a name. Investigators tried anyway. They photographed victims' faces when the heads were recovered, hoping someone might recognize them. They circulated descriptions of scars, tattoos, and dental work. They interviewed transients in the Kingsbury Run camps, hoping someone might recall a missing companion. But the transient population was, by definition, in constant flux, and many potential witnesses had already moved on to another city long before detectives arrived to ask questions. Early theories about the killer ranged widely. Some speculated a deranged former medical student or disgraced doctor, pointing to the precision of the dismemberments. Others suggested a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, someone with practical experience cutting large animals rather than formal medical training. Still others floated the idea of multiple killers, or a cult performing ritualistic murders, though no evidence ever supported such theories. As more bodies surfaced in the following months, public fear intensified. Newspapers ran the story day after day, and the phrase torso murders entered the city's vocabulary as a permanent, dreaded fixture. Detectives found themselves in the unusual position of investigating crimes where the most basic question in any homicide, who was the victim, often had no answer at all. Without a name, there was no family to interview, no employer to question, no last known movements to trace backward toward a possible killer. Investigators tried creative workarounds, comparing dental records against the limited files kept by area dentists, checking laundry marks on any clothing recovered near a body, and cross-referencing physical descriptions against reports of missing transients filed by rail yard employees and mission workers. These efforts occasionally bore modest fruit, but for several of the victims, no amount of effort ever produced a name, and they were ultimately buried in unmarked or minimally marked graves, cataloged only by case number and the date of their discovery. Part 4. The killer's signature. As additional victims were discovered over the following years, ultimately at least a dozen bodies attributed to the same killer between 1935 and 1938, a disturbing signature emerged. Nearly every victim had been decapitated, often with a single clean stroke that coroners believed required real skill and a very sharp blade. Many bodies had also been dismembered further, with limbs separated at the joints in a manner that suggested familiarity with human anatomy. In several cases, the killer appeared to have drained the body of blood before disposal, and some victims showed signs of chemical treatment to the skin, possibly an attempt to slow decomposition or perhaps to complicate identification. The bodies were typically discovered in or near Kingsbury Run, though later victims turned up elsewhere around the city, including along the shore of Lake Erie and in abandoned buildings. This pattern led investigators, along with the coroner who oversaw many of the autopsies, to theorize that the killer possessed at least some anatomical knowledge, whether through formal medical training, veterinary work, mortuary experience, or employment in a slaughterhouse. The coroner at the time argued forcefully that the killer had genuine surgical skill, a claim that shaped much of the ensuing investigation and pushed detectives to focus attention on local physicians and medical professionals who might have fallen into disgrace or addiction. Police profiling, in the sense we understand it today, did not yet exist as a formal discipline, but investigators nonetheless attempted something like it, compiling a working theory of the killer as a man of some intelligence and resources, capable of luring or overpowering victims without drawing attention, possessing a private space in which to perform the dismemberments, and having access to transportation to move bodies to different disposal sites. This portrait of an educated, capable, even respectable-seeming individual hiding a monstrous secret unsettled the public more than a simple portrait of a drifter or vagrant might have. It suggested the killer could be anyone, a neighbor, a doctor, a business owner encountered on the street without a hint of what he was capable of. Coroners who examined the remains noted with some unease that the dismemberments did not appear rushed or frantic, the hallmark of a panicked or opportunistic attacker, but rather methodical, performed with a steadiness that implied either extensive practice or an unusual composure in the presence of the dead. This observation fed directly into the theory that the killer had access to a private location, where he could work without fear of interruption, a garage, a basement, a rented room, somewhere secluded enough to carry out such an operation over what the coroner believed may have been an extended period rather than mere minutes. The apparent draining of blood from several victims, combined with the near total absence of blood found at the disposal sites themselves, reinforced the belief that the killings did not take place where the bodies were ultimately found, meaning the killer transported his victims, whether alive, unconscious, or already dead, from one location to another, a logistical detail that further narrowed the profile of a capable, resourceful individual rather than an impulsive drifter acting on sudden, violent impulse. Part 5. Panic across Cleveland. As the death toll climbed and newspapers published increasingly graphic accounts of each new discovery, ordinary life in Cleveland began to change. Parents kept children closer to home, particularly warning them away from the rail yards and ravines that had once been treated as unremarkable parts of the urban landscape. Women reported feeling unsafe walking alone after dark in neighborhoods near Kingsbury Run. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some residents whispered that the killer was a doctor performing illegal experiments. Others claimed he was a member of a satanic cult or a serial killer who had already struck in other cities under different names. Vigilante groups reportedly organized patrols near the ravine, hoping to catch the killer in the act, though these amateur efforts produced no real results and occasionally hampered the official investigation by trampling potential evidence or frightening away transients who might otherwise have served as witnesses. The pressure on city officials mounted with every new headline. Some businesses near Kingsbury Run reported a noticeable drop in foot traffic, as residents avoided streets that ran close to the ravine even in broad daylight. School teachers in nearby neighborhoods later recalled warning students never to wander near the tracks or the gully, folding the murders into the everyday cautionary lessons given to children. Radio broadcasts carried updates on the case alongside national news, ensuring that even residents who did not read a newspaper closely encountered the story regularly. Cleveland's mayor and safety director faced growing public demand for a resolution, and it was in this climate of fear and frustration that the city turned to its most celebrated law enforcement figure for help. Eliot Ness enters the investigation. By the mid-1930s, Eliot Ness had already become a national symbol of incorruptible law enforcement, having led the federal team credited with helping bring down the Chicago bootlegging empire of Al Capone earlier in the decade. When Ness arrived in Cleveland to take the position of safety director in 1935, he was tasked primarily with rooting out police corruption and organized crime within the city, a mission at which he found considerable early success, dismantling several corrupt units within the department and cracking down on illegal gambling operations. But as the Torso murders escalated and public fear reached a fever pitch, pressure mounted for Ness to personally involve himself in the case, despite it falling somewhat outside his official jurisdiction as a director focused on administrative and anti-corruption reform rather than a homicide detective. Ness approached the investigation methodically, in keeping with his reputation, assembling detectives, forensic specialists, and even outside consultants to review the evidence gathered so far. He ordered increased patrols around Kingsbury Run and the surrounding rail yards, pushed for better coordination between departments, and personally reviewed case files and crime scene photographs. Yet Ness, for all his fame and his genuine investigative skill, found himself confronting a fundamentally different kind of criminal than the bootleggers and mobsters he had built his career pursuing. Organized. Crime left paper trails, informants, and predictable patterns of profit. The Torso killer left almost nothing. No consistent witnesses, no financial motive, no criminal network to infiltrate. As the body count grew and the investigation dragged on without an arrest, the pressure on Ness intensified from every direction, the press, the public, and City Hall, all demanding the kind of decisive victory he had delivered against Capone years earlier. Ness reportedly kept detailed personal files on the case, separate from the official police. Records, reviewing crime scene photographs late into the night, and consulting privately with the coroner and select detectives he trusted most. Colleagues later described him as visibly affected by the case in a way his earlier assignments had never touched him, a reflection perhaps of the case's uniquely elusive nature and the mounting sense that traditional investigative methods, so effective against organized crime's paper trails and informants, were simply not built to catch a killer who left behind so little. Part 7. Inside the investigation. Behind the scenes, the day-to-day work of the investigation was grinding and often frustrating. Detectives examined each crime scene as thoroughly as the science of the era allowed, photographing body positions, collecting soil samples, and searching for fibers or foreign materials on the remains. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, including residents of the Kingsbury Run shanty camps, railroad workers, local business owners, and anyone who might have seen a victim in the company of another person before disappearing. Early forensic science provided some tools. Autopsies could determine approximate time of death, general health of the victim, and sometimes evidence of the tools used in the dismemberment, but lacked the precision modern investigators take for granted. There was no way to test for trace DNA, no computer databases to cross-reference dental records nationally, and fingerprint matching depended entirely on a victim already having a record on file with a law enforcement agency. Investigators made mistakes along the way, as any human effort under such pressure inevitably does. Some crime scenes were not secured quickly enough, allowing curious onlookers or souvenir hunters to disturb evidence. Communication breakdowns between different police units and between Cleveland police and outside jurisdictions where victims were sometimes discovered occasionally slowed the sharing of critical information. The sheer volume of tips and false leads, many stemming from public panic and eager but unreliable witnesses, consumed enormous investigative resources without producing results. Over time, these accumulated obstacles, a killer leaving minimal evidence, forensic technology inadequate to the task, and a victim. Population that was difficult to identify or track, combined to stall the investigation despite the enormous effort poured into it. Detectives maintained enormous case files, cross-referencing dates, locations, and physical descriptions in an effort to find patterns that might point toward a single suspect. Work that today would be assisted by computer databases, but which in the 1930s had to be done entirely by hand, index cards and typed reports stacked in growing piles within the homicide units. Offices. Officers assigned to the case described the frustration of chasing down tips that led nowhere, a caller claiming to have seen a suspicious man near the ravine, a rumor that a local doctor had been seen burning bloody clothing, a report of a stranger asking unusual questions at a rail yard, each requiring hours of legwork to investigate and ultimately eliminate the suspects. Over the course of the investigation, detectives in Ness's team considered a wide range of suspects, though none were ever definitively linked to the murders through solid evidence. Several local physicians came under suspicion at various points, given the coroner's insistence that the killer possessed real surgical skill, though none were formally charged. Butchers and slaughterhouse workers were also investigated, given their familiarity with cutting large bodies of flesh and their potential access to tools capable of the precise dismemberments seen in the case. Transients themselves were considered as possible suspects, on the theory that someone embedded within the very communities being targeted might have easier access to victims and knowledge of their movements. Local criminals with histories of violence were also questioned, though the meticulous, almost ritualistic nature of the killings seemed inconsistent with the more impulsive violence typically associated with the era's gangland figures. Among all these threads, one suspect emerged as a particular focus for investigators working closely with Ness, a man named Frank Dolezal, a laborer with connections to several of the victims through mutual acquaintances and shared drinking establishments. Dolezal was arrested in 1939 and, under questioning, reportedly confessed to at least one of the murders, though the circumstances of his interrogation later raised serious concerns, and he died in custody before ever standing trial. His death officially ruled a suicide, though questions about the circumstances persisted for decades afterward. Many historians and researchers who have studied the case since have expressed skepticism that Dolezal was the actual killer, noting inconsistencies in his confession and the troubling nature of how it was obtained. Another name that surfaced during and after the investigation was that of a physician from a prominent local family, a man whom Ness reportedly considered a strong suspect privately, but against whom no formal charges were ever filed, in part due to insufficient evidence, and in part due to the social and legal complications of accusing a well-connected figure without proof that would hold up in court. It is important to state clearly that none of these theories were ever proven, and the true identity of the killer, if any of these individuals were indeed responsible, was never established with certainty. Investigators also briefly considered the possibility that more than one person might have been involved, perhaps a partnership between someone with medical or anatomical knowledge and someone else responsible for locating and luring victims from within the transient community, though this theory, too, remained speculative and unsupported by hard evidence. The sheer breadth of suspects considered, ranging from respected professionals to anonymous drifters, reflects just how little concrete evidence investigators ever had to work with, a situation that allowed reasonable suspicion to fall on an unusually wide cross-section of Cleveland society without ever narrowing convincingly to a single provable culprit. Part 9. Kingsbury Run. To understand the murders, one must understand Kingsbury Run itself, a place that functioned almost as a character in the unfolding tragedy. The ravine cut through the eastern side of Cleveland, a deep gash in the urban landscape lined with railroad tracks feeding into the industrial flats below. By day, freight trains rumbled through, carrying goods to and from the city's factories and mills. By night, the ravine became something else entirely, a shadowed corridor largely abandoned by official oversight, where transients built shelters from scavenged materials and lived largely outside the notice of city authorities. The geography itself aided concealment, steep slopes covered in brush and weeds, isolated pockets invisible from the surrounding streets, and enough distance from residential areas that screams or struggles might easily go unheard. The homeless communities that called Kingsbury Run home were themselves fluid and constantly shifting. Men and women arriving by freight train, staying for days or weeks and moving on when opportunity called elsewhere. This constant turnover meant that a person's absence might not be noticed for considerable time if it was noticed at all. Railroad yards throughout the city offered similar concealment, and several victims were discovered near tracks or in areas adjacent to rail infrastructure, suggesting the killer either lived near these areas himself or specifically sought out victims who frequented them. The very features that made Kingsbury Run a refuge for those with nowhere else to go, its isolation, its distance from prying eyes, its transient population, also made its residents extraordinarily vulnerable to a predator who understood exactly how to exploit those conditions. Longtime residents of the surrounding neighborhoods later described the ravine in almost mythic terms, a place children were warned away from long before the murders began, its steep banks and tangled undergrowth lending it an air of menace even in ordinary times. The railroad itself added its own rhythm to the area, the periodic rumble and whistle of freight trains passing through at all hours, sounds that could easily have masked a struggle or a cry for help from anyone not standing close enough to investigate. For the men and women who called Kingsbury Run home, the ravine represented both refuge and risk in equal measure, a place to rest between journeys that also, unbeknownst to them, had become hunting grounds for someone who saw their anonymity not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Part 10. The killer evolves. As the killings continued across 1936 and into 1937, investigators began to notice changes in the killer's methods and victim selection. Where the earliest known victims had been found within or very near Kingsbury Run itself, later bodies turned up scattered more widely around the city, including sites along Lake Erie's shoreline and in other isolated pockets of the urban landscape. Some researchers have interpreted this spreading pattern as a deliberate response to the increased police presence around Kingsbury Run following the earlier discoveries, suggesting the killer was adapting to avoid the patrols Ness had ordered. The condition of the remains also shifted over time, with later victims sometimes showing more extensive dismemberment or different methods of disposal, findings that some investigators read as an escalation in the killer's confidence or perhaps a growing comfort with the act itself. This adaptability frustrated detectives enormously. Every time they adjusted patrol patterns or increased surveillance in one area, The killer appeared to shift his activity elsewhere, staying just ahead of the investigation's efforts to corner him. Some researchers have suggested this adaptability itself points toward a killer with above-average intelligence and a genuine capacity for long-term planning, someone who monitored press coverage of the case closely enough to adjust his own behavior in response to what he read, a chilling thought that implied the killer was, in some sense, an active participant in the public conversation about his own crimes, even as he remained hidden from it. The frustration within the police department grew palpable as month after month passed without a breakthrough, despite the enormous resources devoted to the case. Part 11. Eliot Ness's controversial decision. In August of 1938, following the discovery of 2 more victims, Ness made a decision that would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. He ordered the burning of the shanty, encampments in Kingsbury Run, reasoning that eliminating the shelters would remove both potential victims from the killer's reach and potential hiding places the killer himself might be using. Police and fire crews descended on the ravine and set fire to the makeshift structures, displacing the transient population that had called the area home. The decision provoked immediate and sharp public reaction. Critics accused Ness of punishing the very people the investigation was supposed to protect, destroying what so little shelter impoverished and displaced men and women had without ever catching the killer responsible for the murders. Newspapers that had previously celebrated Ness's crime-fighting record now published scathing editorials, questioning both the humanity and the effectiveness of the decision. Defenders of the move argued that the encampments had become genuinely dangerous, not only from the killer, but from the general lawlessness that had taken root in an area beyond regular police oversight, and that dispersing the population, however harsh the method, may have disrupted the killer's hunting ground and access to victims. Whether the burning of the shanty towns actually helped end the killings remains a subject of historical debate. No further murders definitively attributed to the torso killer occurred in Cleveland after this period, which some have cited as evidence the action worked. Others point out that the timing may simply be coincidental, or that the killer, aware of the intensified scrutiny following years of investigation, may have simply relocated his activities elsewhere, possibly to another city where later unsolved murders bore some resemblance to the Cleveland pattern, or may have stopped killing for entirely unrelated reasons, including death, imprisonment for an unrelated crime, or institutionalization. The displaced residents of Kingsbury Run themselves became, in the weeks following the fire, something of a forgotten footnote in the larger drama of the investigation. Their shelters reduced to ash, and their already precarious lives made more difficult still, a human cost that many contemporary accounts of the case glossed over in favor of focusing on the killer's identity and Ness's tactics. Later, historians examining the episode have tended to view it as emblematic of the broader tension running through the entire case, between the genuine need to catch a dangerous killer and the treatment of an already marginalized population as expendable in service of that goal. The investigation begins to collapse. Despite Ness's continued involvement, the investigation's momentum began to fade as 1938 drew to a close. Political pressure within City Hall shifted as public attention gradually moved toward other concerns, and the enormous financial and personnel resources that had been devoted to the case for years became increasingly difficult to justify without a resolution in sight. The evidence trail, thinned from the very beginning, had grown colder still, with witnesses scattered or gone, physical evidence yielding no further leads, and the pool of viable suspects narrowing without producing a conviction. Public disappointment simmered beneath the surface of the city's relief that the murders seemed to have stopped, a strange mixture of gratitude that the killing had ended and frustration that no one had ever been definitively brought to justice for it. Growing doubts about the direction of the investigation, including skepticism about the Dolezal confession and questions about whether the true killer had ever truly been identified, ate away at public confidence. Ness himself, whose reputation had been built on decisive victories against organized crime, found his standing in Cleveland diminished by his association with a case that, despite enormous effort, ended without a clear resolution. He would eventually leave his position as safety director, his later career never quite recapturing the triumphant momentum of his early years. Budget records from the period show the case had consumed a substantial share of the department's investigative resources over its multi-year run, funds and personnel hours that, in the absence of a conviction, became increasingly difficult for city officials to defend before a public eager to see those resources redirected toward other pressing concerns as the Depression continued to grind on. The case files themselves, thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and interview. Transcripts were eventually archived, a monument to the scale of the effort and, simultaneously, to its ultimate inconclusiveness: why the killer was never caught. Looking back with the benefit of nearly a century of hindsight, historians and forensic experts point to several converging factors that allowed the torso killer to escape justice entirely. Chief among these was the almost complete absence of the forensic technology that modern investigators rely upon. There was no DNA analysis available in the 1930s, meaning biological evidence that might today identify a killer. Within hours yielded nothing useful at the time. Fingerprint databases existed only for individuals who already had criminal records or had been fingerprinted for some other official purpose, meaning an unidentified victim or an unidentified killer without a prior record could never be matched against existing files. Record keeping across different police jurisdictions was inconsistent and often poorly coordinated, meaning connections between victims found in different areas or potential links to similar crimes in other cities were difficult to establish with confidence. Perhaps most significantly, the victims themselves, many of them transient, impoverished, and living on the margins of society, were frequently impossible to identify at all, robbing investigators of the most basic starting point for any homicide case: a name, a family, a network of relationships that might lead back to a killer. Jurisdictional confusion also played a role, as victims were discovered across different areas of the city and sometimes just outside Cleveland's official boundaries, complicating coordination between agencies that did not always share information efficiently. Each of these factors alone might have been surmountable, but together they created conditions in which even a highly motivated, well-resourced investigation, backed by a nationally famous lawman, could not produce an arrest that would hold up in court. Modern forensic experts who have revisited the case files in subsequent decades have noted that certain physical evidence, had it been preserved using today's standards and later subjected to advanced testing, might conceivably have yielded a genetic profile capable of identifying either a victim or the killer. Unfortunately, evidence preservation practices of the era were not designed with future scientific advances in mind, and much of the original physical evidence has since been lost, degraded, or discarded entirely, foreclosing any possibility of applying modern techniques retroactively to the case. The legacy of the Cleveland torso murders. In the decades since the killing stopped, the case has left a lasting imprint on American criminal justice and popular culture alike. Some historians argue the case contributed to a growing recognition within law enforcement of the need for better forensic capabilities and more systematic approaches to tracking transient or otherwise hard-to-identify victims, ideas that would slowly develop into the modern discipline of criminal profiling decades later. The torso murders are frequently cited in discussions of early cold case investigation, illustrating both the limitations of period-appropriate forensic science and the enduring difficulty of solving crimes against victims who lack strong social or institutional ties. The case has also become a fixture of popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and dramatized retellings, each attempting to answer the question that official investigators never definitively could. Eliot Ness's involvement, in particular, has ensured the case remains linked in public memory to one of the era's most celebrated law enforcement figures, adding a layer of tragic irony to a career otherwise defined by triumph over Chicago's most notorious criminal enterprise. Historians continue to study the case, not only for its unsolved nature, but for what it reveals about Depression-era Cleveland, a city grappling with poverty, displacement, and the strain those conditions placed on both its most vulnerable residents and the institutions meant to protect them. Academic conferences on criminal justice history periodically revisit the case as a teaching example, illustrating both the promise and the limits of celebrity-led law enforcement, since Ness's national fame did little to compensate for the era's forensic shortcomings. True crime writers have returned to the case repeatedly across the decades, and the city of Cleveland itself has, at various points, incorporated the story into local historical tours and museum exhibits, treating it as an inseparable part of the city's Depression-era identity alongside its more celebrated industrial and cultural achievements. The mystery that endures. Nearly a century after the first bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run, the Cleveland torso, murders remain formally unsolved. Contemporary historians generally agree that Frank Dolezal's confession, extracted under questionable interrogation conditions and never tested at trial, does not represent a reliable resolution to the case. Some researchers continue to favor the theory that a prominent, medically trained local figure, the individual Ness reportedly suspected privately, was indeed responsible, though the absence of definitive proof means this remains a theory rather than an established fact. Others believe the true killer may never be identified at all, lost to history along with the true names of several of his victims. What is certain is that the murders exposed the profound vulnerability of a population the broader society had already chosen not to see. The drifters, the displaced, the impoverished men and women who called railroad ravines and shantytowns home during one of the hardest decades in American history. Nearly a century later, the Cleveland torso murders remain one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. The victims deserve to be remembered not simply as names in a police file, or in many cases, as people whose names were never recovered, but as lives cut short during one of the nation's darkest decades. Despite advances in forensic science, the identity of the killer may never be known. Yet every new generation of historians and investigators returns to the case, hoping that somewhere among the forgotten records and fading memories lies the final clue that could solve the mystery forever.